Okay, so welcome to our video about costs. We wanted to put a video together that kind of allowed us to compare the costs of basic things that we need in Antalya, Turkey versus our home in Calgary, Canada. So we've done everything to Canadian prices and Turkish lira. If you're not from Canada or Turkey, you can do the conversions yourself. But basically what we tried to do is keep all the units so that everything was comparable. So every item we bought, I tried to break it down into its smallest units, and then we did a comparison of the per unit cost in Calgary and Antalya in Canadian dollars at the end so that they're sort of equivalent. We've done that sort of throughout the video, and that's how we manage the math part of it.
So the segments we wanted to talk about for comparing costs are going to be our groceries that we buy day-to-day food-wise, as well as some of the groceries that we buy non-food like items. We're also going to be talking about dining out, and we're going to be talking about transportation costs.
One of the things we needed to do in order to properly compare is also consider the fact that we needed to have equivalent sizes. So that part was a little bit tricky in terms of obviously buying things in North America, you tend to get things in much bulkier sizes, right? So we're not doing Costco-like comparisons here. We're basically trying to do a similar size product in both locations, not taking into account that in Canada sometimes you can get buy 5 get 1 free, or like all those kind of discounts, or get a discount if you buy 2 on just about anything now. We're taking all that out of the equation, which could be somewhat misleading, I suppose. If you wanted to take a bulk approach with Canada, that would bring the Canadian price down a little bit. Everything else though, we're trying to be as even as possible, looking at quality, looking at content, size, and all that stuff. So hopefully that works out for everybody as you watch it. All right, so one thing we need to talk about before we get into prices here is just the state of recent inflation in Turkey. Over the last 2 years, Turkey's experienced significant inflation. It's affected the prices of various goods quite dramatically. For example, vegetables and fruits, so items like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, have seen price increases ranging from 30% to upwards of 100% within a year or even less. But I did want to show you just an example. One of the interesting things that Google Maps allows you to do when you're looking at the pictures of a restaurant is compare menu photos that people have taken at different points in time. And I just wanted to have our favorite place here, the Macho Old Town across the street. And just the cost of a burger a little over a year ago to the cost of a burger today is up around 119% in just that short time span. So it's very much been a big deal here, and I think it must make it incredibly hard for people locally to deal with that. Obviously, wages don't keep in line with that, right? So it makes it incredibly complicated.
So something we're doing here at Antalya is we're buying water to drink in the apartment. We had read both that you shouldn't drink the water, and we'd also read that doesn't matter if you drink the water. But if you do drink the water, we had also read that it can sometimes taste a little off. And we had nothing in our rental that we read about that said we couldn't drink the water, but we decided to err on the side of our health because we didn't want to have any issues. So what we're doing is we're buying water. And it is one of these big jugs is
5 liters.
5 liters, and it costs us on average $1.40, and we buy 2 of those big ones every couple of days. We're going through a lot of water. It's been really hot. And then what we do is we transfer that to this, and then we transfer this to this, and we drink a lot.
And we didn't factor that into any of the costs we're going to show you in this, so that's another extra cost that we have here in Antalya that you wouldn't have in Calgary. All right, so I'll kick us off today. We'll start with ground coffee. Drip coffee is not something we're necessarily buying, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but it is obviously a staple that a lot of people would buy, and you can buy very similar bags of it here as you can in Canada. So you'll see as the prices kind of fill out here. Long story short, at the end of the day, coffee, ground coffee anyways, is about 25% cheaper in Antalya than it is in Calgary.
I want to talk about eggs. Now, in Canada, we buy all our eggs by the dozen, or sometimes you can find it by a half dozen. Here in Antalya, the first thing we did was we weren't sure how much we were going to be cooking, so we bought a half dozen. There was a half dozen pack. Next time we went back, we decided, well, we'll just pick up a dozen. And as it turns out, you can't buy a dozen eggs. You can buy 6, or you can buy a box of 10, which we kind of had to adjust to a little bit. But as it turns out, eggs are 37% cheaper here in Antalya than they are in Canada.
All right, I had the pleasure of doing milk. We buy milk everywhere we go, and I try to take 1 liter containers here. The interesting thing about Europe is it's very difficult unless you're in Ireland or England to find larger than 1 liter containers. So I did a 1 liter to 1 liter comparison, looking at 2% milk in Canada versus 1.5% milk in Turkey. Pretty similar taste. Everything about it is relatively close. And the long and short of it is, at the end of the day, that milk is actually quite a bit cheaper in Antalya. It's about 38% cheaper than it is in Calgary. So that's been a nice savings for us.
The next thing that we're buying a lot of is we are eating a lot of sandwiches. We don't have an oven, so as it turns out, we're doing a lot of sandwiches. In the beginning, we were buying loaves of bread. I like to give my loaf of bread a little squeeze in the grocery store just to see how if it feels a little bit fresher, and I thought I was getting fairly fresh bread, but wasn't. It was, after one day, it would be very dried out. So we've switched to buns, which have turned out to be a great item for us for sandwiches. And as it turns out, the bread, a loaf of bread, is 25% cheaper in Antalya than it is at home. It just happens to be unfortunate that it doesn't last very long because it dries out like crazy. Then our next item is cereal. Dan was able to buy a box of honey and oat cereal, which seemed pretty similar to what we have in Canada, and it was basically terrible. He didn't like it at all. He's waiting for me to eat it with my oatmeal, and I've been using some granola for that instead. But we normally buy we go through a lot of cereal because we will eat in quite a bit for our breakfast. As it turns out, cereal is 10% cheaper in Antalya than it is in Canada, but unfortunately it tastes terrible.
And back to me to do another fun one. Let's talk about Doritos chips. It's funny, everywhere we've traveled, Doritos chips are basically the one brand that seems to be everywhere, and you can get flavors that are pretty darn close to the ones that you can get in North America. In this case, I'm looking at a bag in Canada versus which is nacho cheese flavored versus a taco bag in Turkey, but the prices are the same either way. Obviously, the bags are a little bit bigger in Canada. Like everything else that's bad for you, you get larger sizes of it in North America. But this is another one where they're encouraging you to eat them in Turkey because they are 26% cheaper in Antalya than they are in Calgary.
For anyone who knows me, I have a thing about toilet paper. During the pandemic, I might have been one of those horrible stockpilers, so that by the time we were leaving to live in Houston, I might have had an unnatural number of packages, large packages of Costco toilet paper, and ended up giving most of them away. In retrospect, I should have just put them in our storage unit. But here in Antalya, we are buying small packages, relatively small packages. Nothing is actually double rolled here. And we were able to buy a pretty decent package of 16 rolls at our grocery store around the corner because, of course, we also have to carry it back to our apartment. But as it turns out, with all of our calculations, the toilet paper here is 24% cheaper than it is in Canada. And even though we can't buy like 36 36 rolls at a time. As it turns out, toothpaste goes the other direction. Toothpaste lasts us normal amount of time, and we were warned before we started our travels that sometimes it can be hard to find what we consider pharmacy type stuff in the grocery store. You can find it here. North American products tend to be a little bit more expensive, and as it turns out, the Colgate Total toothpaste that we buy here is actually 148% more expensive than it is 148% more expensive in Antalya than it is in Canada. Don't know why. I would guess maybe it's because grocery stores just buy bigger volumes to sell, and the grocery stores we're buying from are quite small.
All right, when we were talking about divvying up these items for each of us to talk about, burgers was clearly in my category, and cheeseburgers are clearly in my category, and I decided to compare my favorite place, Original Joe's in Calgary, to the Macho Old Town here in Antalya, mostly because the burgers are nearly identical. They both come with fries, they both have similar toppings, and they seem about equally filling, which makes it quite good. And unfortunately for me and my waistline, Antalya is also cheaper here. The same burger is about 31% cheaper in Antalya than it is in Calgary.
Those of you that know us know that we're big coffee drinkers. We're not super clever with brands and how it's roasted and such. We got into a habit during COVID that for us to go out, we would go out a couple times a week and just drive over to Starbucks and buy our morning coffee, bring it back and drink it at home. We're doing similar things while we're traveling here. We find a coffee shop or a little bakery that we like to have our morning coffee at. So our coffee shop lattes are 9% cheaper here in Antalya than they are in Canada. That, just a PS, that doesn't include the chocolate croissant that goes with that coffee in the morning.
And lastly, beer. As we mentioned, beer is one of the more expensive things in Turkey. And so I assumed when I started this that Canadian beer prices would actually be better than Turkish beer prices. Because we were just looking at some of the prices for alcohol generally here, and it is actually quite expensive. What I didn't take into account is just how expensive beer has become in Canada over the last little while. We're traditionally more wine drinkers than we are beer drinkers, but surprisingly, when I did the math against very similar beer, it wound up being 20% cheaper, almost 21% cheaper for beer in Antalya than it is in Calgary, which I did not expect, but I'll be drinking more beer now, so that's good. Okay, and then the sort of the last subject sort of our research that we did here is taxis and Ubers. It's definitely worth comparing because we just came from Ireland where taxis were like off the charts expensive, like so expensive it was almost punitive. A half an hour cab ride was 75 euros. It was just crazy. But Ubers here are quite a bit better. So I wanted to compare them, or taxis here are quite a bit better. There are no Ubers here than Canada. So I wanted to compare taxis in Antalya versus Ubers in Canada. So I picked a very similar route in both, around a 13-kilometer route. And then decided to do just a comparison on the all-in price. And this is another place where Turkey comes in quite a bit cheaper, almost 30% cheaper to take a taxi here than it is in Canada, and significantly better than it is in Ireland. So taxis have actually been our main choice of transportation here, other than walking. We haven't spent time here on the public transportation system or others because taxis have been quite affordable and are absolutely everywhere.
One of the extra monthly costs that I have is I still like to get a salon mani-pedi. And in Canada, I had been paying 135 CAD when we were living in Airdrie. And I have had to go out and find a new salon in every city that we've gone to. And our most recent, of course, is Antalya. And I was able to find a salon that was 1,300 Turkish lira, which is the equivalent of $51. And maybe throw a tip on top. 62% cheaper than what I was getting for in Airdrie. So pretty happy with this.
Okay, that's it for our little sampling of prices. One of the things I wanted to do, though, is make sure that we put a table on here that sort of lays out the comparisons that we've done. So that table is here, allows you to see that we've kind of tried to convert everything to similar units and convert the CAD and Turkish lira numbers. Basically, the exchange rate that we used for everything in here was 25.15 Turkish lira to $1 Canadian. Obviously, these numbers would change slightly if you change that, but that seems like a relatively consistent rate of late. Anyways, have a look.